What if memory could lie, not quietly, but together? The question hangs in the air like dust caught in sunlight. We tend to think of memory as a personal archive, a private record of what we have seen, heard, and lived through. It feels intimate, reliable, almost sacred. Yet history has a way of whispering doubts, reminding us that what feels solid inside the mind may not always align with what truly happened. Imagine a crowded room. A casual conversation turns reflective, then strange. Someone mentions an event they remember clearly, a death, a moment of global mourning, a turning point in history. Others nod. They remember it too. The images feel sharp. News broadcasts, speeches, a collective sense of loss. And then, slowly, the certainty begins to fracture. Records are checked. Dates are verified. The event never happened. Not in the way it was remembered. Not at all. This is where our journey begins, not with an error, but with a mystery. For centuries, memory was treated as a kind of recording device, imperfect perhaps, but fundamentally honest. Modern science has since complicated that view. We now know memory is not a replay, but a reconstruction. Each recollection is an act of creation shaped by emotion, expectation, culture, and time. Still, even knowing this, we assume that large groups of people cannot all misremember the same thing in the same way. Surely collective memory corrects itself. But what if it doesn't? Across continents and generations, millions of people have found themselves unsettled by moments when reality seems to contradict what they remember with absolute confidence. These are not vague impressions or half-forgotten details. They are vivid scenes, spoken words, familiar images, memories tied to childhood, identity, and emotion. And they are shared. This phenomenon challenges more than facts. It challenges trust, not in institutions or records, but in ourselves. The human mind is remarkably good at filling gaps. It smooths rough edges. It favors meaning over precision. In doing so, it helps us survive, connect, and tell stories about who we are. But sometimes that same gift blurs the line between what was experienced and what was absorbed indirectly, through repetition, culture, or expectation. A quote repeated often enough can replace the original. An image recreated endlessly can overwrite the source. A story retold across years can gain details that feel earned, even if they were never there. Over time, the remembered version may become more emotionally satisfying than the truth itself. This is not deception in the usual sense. No single author, no clear intent, just the quiet convergence of millions of minds arriving independently at the same mistaken conclusion. A shared certainty with no origin point. Why does this happen? Psychologists suggest patterns. Suggestion, familiarity, narrative symmetry. Neuroscientists point to how the brain encodes meaning rather than detail. Cultural historians note the power of repetition and symbolism. Each explanation offers a piece, but none fully resolves the unease, because the deeper question remains. If memory can be collectively wrong about simple things, words, images, placements, what does that mean for how we remember events that shaped our understanding of the world? How much of what we know is reinforced by evidence, and how much by agreement? In the chapters ahead, we will move carefully through a series of moments where memory and record diverge. We will examine them not as proofs of hidden forces or altered realities, but as mirrors, reflections of how human consciousness works when it is shared. Each story will offer a clue, each contradiction, an invitation, not to doubt everything, but to listen more closely. Because understanding memory is not about discovering its failures, it is about understanding its purpose, and perhaps learning what it reveals about the fragile, creative, and deeply human way we make sense of time. It began with a funeral that never was. In 2009, at a small paranormal conference, Fiona Broom, a researcher with a curiosity for the unexplained, made an offhand comment. She recalled the death of Nelson Mandela in a South African prison during the 1980s. His funeral, the global mourning, his widow's grief on live television, all etched vividly in her memory. To her surprise, several people around her nodded in agreement. They remembered the same thing, the same images, the same emotions, the same aftermath. There was just one problem. Nelson Mandela was still alive. He had been released from prison in 1990 and had gone on to become the president of South Africa in 1994. Broom was stunned. Broom was not because she was wrong. People misremember things all the time, but because others remembered the exact same wrong thing with startling detail. They didn't just agree, they believed, and they remembered it the way people remember birthdays, tragedies, and personal milestones, with certainty. This was the seed of what would become known as the Mandela Effect. As Broom documented more examples, thousands of people reached out, not with vague confusion, but with detailed memories. Television broadcasts, school discussions, family conversations, newspaper headlines that never existed. These weren't people trying to be dramatic or contrary. Many were embarrassed by how strongly they believed in something that seemed to have never happened. And yet, the belief remained. What made the phenomenon even more unsettling was the consistency. Not only did people remember Mandela dying in prison, but they also recalled the same reactions from world leaders, the same public protests, even the same historical consequences. Dr. Neil Dagnall, a cognitive psychologist in Manchester, studied the reports and found something remarkable. The memories weren't random. They shared a structure, a narrative. They had internal coherence, emotional texture, and social context, everything you'd expect from an actual experience. Independent surveys echoed this. Before being corrected, around 1 in 5 people believed Mandela had died in prison. Multiply that by a global population, and the numbers become staggering. But how could so many people remember the same thing incorrectly? One explanation lies in how memory forms. When we experience an event, our brains prioritize emotional salience over detail. We don't store a perfect recording, we store meaning. And when large groups of people are exposed to similar stories, media coverage, or cultural narratives, their brains may generate similar memories, even if the underlying facts are false. Still, this doesn't fully explain the intensity of the recollections, or why people can describe visual scenes they never saw, or why these memories feel lived. Modern brain imaging has shown that false memories activate the same neural patterns as real ones. To the mind, there is no discernible difference. The feeling of truth is biological, not evidentiary. The Mandela Effect wasn't just about one man, it became a framework, a way to explore the fragility of collective memory. Soon, other examples emerged, movie lines that never existed, logos that had supposedly changed, songs missing their expected endings. People weren't just misremembering trivial details, they were questioning the reliability of reality itself. But perhaps the real story here isn't about being right or wrong. It's about the power of shared memory and its limits. If a memory can be vivid, emotional, and wrong, what does that say about how we understand our past? It raises a sobering possibility that history, in part, is what we agree to remember, and that truth, at times, may be outvoted by certainty. The Mandela Effect asks us not to believe in alternate timelines or broken realities. It asks something more difficult and more human. To accept that memory, even when shared by millions, can still be a beautiful illusion. Mirror, mirror on the wall. The phrase drifts effortlessly off the tongue, a childhood incantation etched into pop culture. Millions know it. Millions have spoken it aloud. It echoes in parodies, Halloween costumes, and bedtime nostalgia. But when we return to the source, the 1937 Disney film Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. Something strange happens. The line isn't there. Instead, the evil queen gazes into her enchanted glass and says, "Magic mirror on the wall." Not mirror, mirror, magic mirror. For many, this discovery lands like a crack in the foundation of memory. How could something so familiar, so culturally cemented, be wrong? The phrase mirror, mirror feels older than animation itself, a verbal heirloom passed down through generations. But the truth is simple and disorienting. Disney's queen never said those words. This isn't just a case of childhood imprecision. Studies show that over 85% of people recall the incorrect phrase, and they don't just remember it vaguely. They recall hearing it, seeing it, believing it. Some are so certain that they revisit the film expecting a glitch, a missing scene, a misprint. But it's always been magic mirror. Part of the confusion lies in the Grimm brothers' original fairy tale, which did use mirror, mirror. Disney's adaptation changed it, perhaps for rhythm or tone. Yet somehow the old version remained dominant, not on paper, but in minds. Psychologists have tried to unravel the mechanics of this mass misremembering. Rhythmic repetition, they say, is more memorable. Mirror, mirror has a poetic lilt that magic mirror lacks. It's easier to remember, easier to say, more spell-like, in some ways more true to the story's spirit, even if not to its script. But there's more to it. People don't just recall the words, they recall the voice. That icy, imperious tone. They see the queen's reflection flicker. They hear her say it. The memory has weight and sound and texture, and it feels real, not imagined. Brain scans of individuals recalling the false quote show activity in auditory memory centers, the same regions activated when remembering a real sound. In other words, the mind is retrieving an actual experience, even though that experience never happened. And in a cultural twist, Disney itself has inadvertently reinforced the illusion. Merchandise, theme park attractions, and even official branding have used mirror, mirror, feeding the very misquote that contradicts their film. The feedback loop is complete, memory shaping culture and culture reinforcing memory. But why does this matter? Because it reveals something quietly profound. Our memories are not isolated facts. They are shaped by rhythm, suggestion, community, and emotion. They are social creatures, vulnerable to influence and resistant to correction. This single misquote, harmless on its surface, points to a larger pattern, one where the mind doesn't just recall reality, but reimagines it for cohesion, drama, or meaning. The false version survives because it feels more right than the original. And that feeling, not the evidence, is what the brain trusts. In the mirror of memory, perhaps we don't always see what was. We see what fits. And so we ask again without irony, mirror, mirror on the wall, who decides what we remember at all? It's a name you probably haven't spoken aloud in years, yet it lives somewhere in the back of your mind. The Berenstain Bears. A family of talking bears who taught moral lessons through colorful children's books. Their stories sat on classroom shelves, bedtime stacks, and library bins across America. But look again. It's not Berenstain. It's Berenstain with an A. This isn't a minor spelling correction, it's a fracture in time for millions. Adults who grew up reading the books report feeling physically disoriented upon seeing the unfamiliar name. They insist they remember the Stein spelling. They pronounce it with a long E, like Einstein. Some even claim they remember correcting others on the pronunciation. And yet, the books have always been spelled Berenstain since the 1960s. No known editions ever bore an E. Official records, copyrights, first printings all confirm the A. There is no historical trail that supports the collective childhood memory so many carry, but the memory remains. The phenomenon is more than widespread. it's passionate. Internet forums are filled with stories from people who dug up old copies of the books, certain they'd find the truth, only to discover Berenstain printed right there in bold letters. Others describe asking their parents, their teachers, their siblings, only to be met with the same confusion, the same disbelief. It doesn't stop with spelling. It extends to sound. People heard Berenstain. They recall animated specials where the name was pronounced that way. They remember debates about whether it was spelled like Frankenstein. How could all of this be wrong? Psychologists point to phonetic patterns. Stein is more familiar in surnames, especially in North America. It matches common linguistic templates, making it more memorable. Our brains, always searching for patterns, might have automatically corrected the name to something that felt more natural, especially in childhood. But there's another layer. This isn't just about memory. It's about identity. For many, this realization strikes at the heart of trust, not in books, but in themselves. What does it mean to know something, to have been so sure for so long, only to be proven wrong? Some have gone further, suggesting alternate timelines, parallel universes, or a collective slip between dimensions. Not because they crave conspiracy, but because the feeling of wrongness is so powerful, so undeniable. It demands an explanation equal to the emotional weight of the discovery. But perhaps the explanation lies in a quieter place, in the way memory, language, and culture intertwine. Childhood memories are not snapshots. They are emotional impressions. They're built on repetition, context, and the words we expect to see. If every adult around you pronounced it Berenstain, if every playground conversation reinforced it, your mind accepted that version, and it cemented it. The Berenstain mystery doesn't ask us to reject reality. It invites us to reconsider how memory forms and how easily it can congeal into myth. Maybe it was never about a family of bears. Maybe it was always about a family of memories, stitched together by shared belief, then passed silently from one child to the next. And maybe, just maybe, the real question isn't which spelling is right, but why the wrong one felt so true for so long. The stadium roars, the lights blaze, a voice rises above the noise, triumphant, iconic. We are the champions of the world. The crowd erupts. It's the perfect ending. You've heard it at sporting events, in movie climaxes, over victory montages. It's more than a lyric. It's a cultural anthem. But listen closely to Queen's original studio recording of We Are the Champions. The song doesn't end that way. The final line is simply, We are the champions. No soaring of the world, no victorious finish, just a trailing silence. For millions, that silence is deafening. The disbelief is widespread and deep. Fans swear they remember the full phrase at the end. They can hum it, sing it. Hear Freddie Mercury's voice echoing the words into the crowd. And yet, it isn't there. Not in the studio version, not in the version that's played for decades on radio and albums. Why does this feel like a glitch in reality? One reason may lie earlier in the song. The phrase "of the world" does appear, just not at the end. It's sung with force in the middle, embedded in the chorus. That echo, repeated enough, may have found a second home in memory. Over time, listeners, craving that final punch, may have placed it where they felt it belonged. Still, the emotional disconnect remains. People don't just remember the words, they remember the moment, the feeling of closure, of resolution. The song without that final line feels incomplete, like a sentence without punctuation. Dr. Julia Shaw, a researcher in memory and emotion, has explored how music interacts with memory. Songs are not just sound, they are emotional narratives. The brain seeks rhythm, pattern, and payoff, and when those elements are missing, it fills in the gaps. In this case, the mind may have written its own final line. And then there's culture. Movies, commercials, and live performances have often used the "of the world" ending, even when the recording doesn't. These cultural echoes can overwrite memory, especially when paired with high emotion. Over time, we stop distinguishing between what was and what felt right. Queen themselves may have contributed. In some live concerts, Mercury did sing Of the World at the end, improvising for the crowd. Those moments, recorded on bootlegs or seen in documentaries, may have seeded the illusion that it was always part of the song. But the core mystery remains. Why do so many remember something that never happened, with such passion, such clarity? Perhaps it speaks to the nature of memory itself. We don't remember facts, we remember feelings, and we build stories around them. The mind, ever the storyteller, wants the song to end with victory. And so it writes a better ending. This isn't a failure. It's a feature. The brain's ability to reimagine is what allows us to create, to heal, to connect. But in doing so, it can also convince us that fiction was fact. In the end, maybe the real lyric isn't what was sung, but what was felt. And maybe, for those who remember it differently, Freddie Mercury did sing it, not in the studio, but in the vast echoing halls of collective memory. We are the champions of the world, even if only in our minds. A slow-moving motorcade, a warm Texas afternoon, the waving crowds. And then, the unthinkable. For generations of Americans, the assassination of President John F. Kennedy in Dallas was more than a historical event. It was a scar, a shared trauma. And in that shared memory, one image stands out above the rest, a 4-seat convertible. Carrying the President and First Lady with 2 Secret Service agents in front. 4 people. Clear, simple. But the truth is more complex and far more unsettling. Archival footage, photographs, and eyewitness records confirm that 6 people were in that car. John and Jackie Kennedy in the back, Texas Governor John Connally and his wife Nellie in the middle, and 2 Secret Service men in the front. 6, not 4. This detail isn't hidden. It's been public since 1963. And yet, a large portion of the population, especially those over 50, remember a very different image. A simpler scene, fewer passengers, no middle row. Why does the collective memory erase 2 people? Part of the answer may lie in how we absorb tragedy. In moments of shock, the brain narrows its focus. It highlights the central figures. It flattens the background. Cognitive researchers have found that during traumatic events, peripheral details are often lost or altered. We remember what matters most and forget the rest. And in the Kennedy assassination, what mattered was the President and the First Lady, the shocking moment, the Zapruder film. The wave turned into horror. The suit stained red. Everything else becomes noise. But this isn't just a case of memory loss. It's something deeper, an alternate mental image that feels more true than the actual footage. When people are shown the real 6-passenger car, many respond with disbelief or even denial. They insist the film must have been altered. They remember watching it live. They remember the 4-seat car. What they're reacting to isn't a correction. It's a disruption of emotional memory. Media representations may have played a role. Early reenactments, textbooks, and documentaries often focused solely on the Kennedys. Diagrams simplified the layout. Artists' renderings cropped the image. Over time, these simplified versions replaced reality in the minds of millions. Psychologists call this telescoping, the compression of memory to its emotional core. The implications are sobering. If memory can collapse under the weight of emotion, if it can erase entire people from an event witnessed by millions, what else has it edited? This isn't about conspiracy or deception. It's about the mind's effort to make trauma manageable, to reduce chaos to something that can be remembered, repeated, and understood. But in doing so, something is lost. The full complexity, the nuance, the forgotten passengers. And maybe that's the quiet tragedy beneath the louder one, that even our most sacred historical memories can be simplified beyond recognition. The car carried 6, but for many it will always carry 4, not because of what was filmed, but because of what was felt. Take a globe, spin it slowly, and trace your finger south from North America. Where does it land? For millions of people, the mental map is simple. North America sits atop South America, the two continents aligned like stacked blocks, one above, one below. It's an image taught in classrooms, drawn in notebooks, reinforced by childhood puzzles and plastic globes. But there's a problem. South America isn't directly below North America. It's far to the east. In reality, much of South America sits east of the eastern seaboard of the United States. Draw a line straight down from Florida and you'll end up in the Atlantic Ocean, not in Brazil. The continents are offset, tilted, and asymmetrical, not the clean vertical alignment many remember. This is not a trivial cartographical detail. It's a deeply held belief, a spatial memory so strong that when people see a correct map, they often feel disoriented, even betrayed. How could so many remember the world differently? In 2014, geography researchers began noticing something strange. Students, and not just children but adults across the globe, consistently misplaced South America on blank world maps. They weren't unsure. They were confident. They remembered it being further west, lined up neatly beneath the U.S. At first, it seemed like a teaching error, but surveys showed the misplacement spanned generations, education levels, and even continents. People in Europe, Asia, and Australia recalled the same incorrect map layout. This wasn't a localized misunderstanding. It was a global false memory. Psychologist Dr. Sarah Creamer-Rieger studied the phenomenon and found that the brain's internal GPS, the spatial memory system, is surprisingly malleable. It doesn't record precise coordinates. It builds simplified models based on exposure, repetition, and expectation. And maps, the very tools designed to clarify geography, may be part of the problem. Most classroom maps use the Mercator projection, a centuries-old design that distorts the actual sizes and positions of continents to fit a rectangular frame. South America is often squeezed into a space that makes it appear more directly below the U.S. The alignment looks cleaner, easier, more symmetrical. Over years of exposure, that clean symmetry becomes lodged in the mind. It feels right, even when it isn't. But this isn't just about misremembering geography. It's about trust in perception. When confronted with a real map, many people react not with curiosity, but with disbelief. They think the map is wrong, or new, or altered. Because it contradicts something deeper than fact. It contradicts familiarity. Memory researchers have found that geographical false memories trigger the same brain activity as real recollections. To the person experiencing them, there is no difference. The memory isn't weak or fuzzy. It's vivid, confident, and felt. And that confidence is precisely what makes these moments so disorienting. What else might we remember incorrectly? If our mental map of the world, one of the most basic forms of knowledge, can be wrong in such a consistent way, what does that say about other kinds of memory? Perhaps maps don't just chart land. Perhaps they chart belief. And perhaps, for many of us, the world is not where we thought it was, not because it moved, but because our minds never fully let it settle. In a way, every map is a story. And sometimes, the one we carry inside us is the one that changes shape. It's one of the most haunting images of the 20th century. A lone man, shopping bag in hand, standing still before a column of military tanks in Beijing's Tiananmen Square. You remember it, everyone does. The defiance, the dust rising from the tanks, the weight of silence on that wide avenue. And then, for many, a memory even more chilling, the tanks rolling forward, crushing the protester beneath their treads. But that never happened. In every surviving recording, the tanks stop. The man climbs onto the lead vehicle. He speaks to the driver. He climbs down. Eventually, he's pulled away, alive. No footage shows his death. No film captures a fatal ending. Yet millions remember otherwise. They remember watching it live on television. They recall news anchors gasping, headlines screaming, the horror of witnessing state violence in real time. For some, it was a formative moment, a loss of innocence, a political awakening, an indelible wound. But the footage doesn't lie. The man was not killed. So where did the memory come from? Psychologists have called this one of the most emotionally charged false memories in modern history. Dr. Elizabeth Loftus, an expert on memory distortion, notes that emotionally intense events are particularly prone to alteration. The brain, overwhelmed by expectation or fear, sometimes fills in what it believes should have happened. In this case, the context was tragic. Hundreds of protesters were killed during the Tiananmen Square crackdown. The air was heavy with grief and outrage. In that climate, a peaceful resolution for the tank man felt improbable, even narratively inconsistent. For many, the brain edited reality to match the emotional truth of the moment. The false memory was reinforced by conversation, by time, by media references. Over decades, the imagined version became more vivid than the real one. When shown the actual footage, people often react with shock and resistance. They remember the death, not as a possibility, as a certainty. This isn't a case of faulty recall. It's the mind doing what it always does, shaping the past into a story that fits its emotional framework. But that doesn't make the story less real. For those who remember the man's death, the trauma is genuine. Their minds encoded it as truth. Their hearts mourned it. The memory left fingerprints. Neuroscience backs this up. Brain scans show that people recalling the false version experience activation in trauma-related areas, the same regions involved in processing real grief. In essence, they didn't just remember a death, they felt it. This dissonance between fact and feeling is what makes the tank man memory so powerful. It reveals how our collective consciousness reshapes itself not just around what happened, but what we feared, what we expected, what we emotionally needed to believe. Perhaps for some, the idea that the man survived feels too hopeful, too implausible, too out of sync with the rest of that bloody chapter in history. So the mind rewrote the ending. But the real ending of the one captured on grainy film remains more powerful precisely because it defies the narrative. A single man stood before a line of tanks, and they stopped. It is a reminder that even in the face of overwhelming force, resistance can endure. Even when memory falters, courage remains. And sometimes the truth is not what we remember, but what we forgot to believe in. A monocle, a top hat, a cane, a twirled mustache, the image is unmistakable. The Monopoly Man, or more formally, Rich Uncle Pennybags, the wealthy mascot of one of the most famous board games in the world. But take a closer look. He's missing something. The monocle, that tiny circular lens perched on his right eye, isn't there. It never was. Not in the original artwork, not in modern editions, not in official merchandise. Throughout the entire 85-year history of Monopoly, the Monopoly Man has never worn a monocle. Yet for most of us, the image feels incomplete without it. We remember it with certainty. We see it in our minds, the exaggerated look of aristocratic surprise, the gleam of the lens, the way it emphasized his cartoonish wealth. Some remember sketching him that way as kids. Others recall it from game nights, boxes, or commercials. But the monocle doesn't exist. So where did it come from? Dr. Kimberly Wade, a researcher in memory and imagery, believes the answer lies in association. Wealthy cartoon characters often share a set of visual traits. Mr. Peanut, the Planters' mascot, does wear a monocle, So do countless villains and caricatures of the rich from pop culture. Over time, the traits blur. One reinforces the other. And the mind, ever eager to categorize, fills in the blanks. When asked to draw the Monopoly Man from memory, over 80% of participants include the monocle, not because they're guessing, but because they're sure. They're remembering something that, to them, feels as visually real as their childhood room. It's not confusion. It's construction, and it's everywhere. Movies, cartoons, and costumes frequently depict the Monopoly Man with a monocle. Halloween outfits sell him that way. Internet memes amplify the illusion. Parodies assume it's canon. In short, the false version has overtaken the truth. This isn't deception. It's cultural editing. Memory, it turns out, is a deeply visual process. The brain stores images as patterns, not pixels. When a character fits a type, rich, old-fashioned, extravagant, the brain draws from its archive of symbols. A monocle is part of that language. It completes the picture. The result is a false memory so compelling, so vivid, that even when corrected, it refuses to fade. People argue with photos. They dig through old closets. They insist an earlier version must have had it. Surely at some point he wore one, but he didn't, and he never has. This case is more than a curiosity. It's a glimpse into how memory isn't static. It's a fluid, active process. We don't just remember what we saw, we remember what made sense to see. And in a world where symbols repeat and overlap, our minds sometimes conflate them into a version that feels more logical, more complete, more real. In the end, the monocle isn't about what's missing from a cartoon man's face. It's about what's added by our minds, not in error, but in story. Because sometimes what we remember isn't what was designed. It's what should have been, according to the quiet expectations shaped by culture, repetition, and time. And that's the paradox. Our memories can be wrong and still feel absolutely right. Picture a horn of plenty, woven, brown, overflowing with fruit. You've seen it before, haven't you? Not just in Thanksgiving imagery, but on clothing tags tucked behind apples and grapes. The logo of Fruit of the Loom, or so you thought. In truth, the Fruit of the Loom logo has never included a cornucopia. No wicker horn, no basket-spilling fruit. Just the fruit alone, arranged in varying styles over the decades, but never emerging from a horn. And yet, millions of people remember it differently. They don't just think the cornucopia was there. They remember it with precision. The shape, the angle, the dark brown texture. Some describe learning the word cornucopia because of that logo, connecting the term with mornings before school, pulling shirts from drawers, tracing the image with their fingers. But the cornucopia was never part of the design. This is not a case of faulty branding. Company archives confirm it. Trademark filings support it. Decades of packaging, advertising, and official art are cornucopia-free. Still, the memory persists, stubborn, vivid, and widely shared. How can something so specific, so detailed, be collectively imagined? Dr. Carol Laney, who studies consumer memory, suggests that the brain doesn't just recall logos, it completes them. A fruit arrangement by itself feels unfinished. The mind, trained by centuries of harvest imagery, adds the expected backdrop, the horn of plenty, the age-old symbol of abundance. And once that image is formed in childhood, reinforced by context and repetition, it sticks. Logos are not just designs. They are emotional anchors, tied to routines, family, identity. When people discover the cornucopia never existed, they don't just feel wrong. They feel unmoored. The illusion is compounded by how visual memory works. Our brains store gist impressions, overall shapes and themes, rather than exact replicas. When memory is triggered, we reconstruct the details using familiar patterns. In this case, the cornucopia is so tightly woven into Western symbolism that it becomes inseparable from the fruit in memory. But there's more. The false image has taken on a life of its own. Online artists, parody brands, and nostalgic designs often include the horn, reinforcing the mistake. The false version circulates widely, gaining visual credibility. Eventually, it becomes the more familiar version, not just in memory, but in culture. This creates a powerful feedback loop. You remember the cornucopia, then you see it again in art, in memes, in conversation. And each time, the memory deepens. Not because it's true, but because it's repeated. The fruit of the loom cornucopia case offers something deeper than branding confusion. It's a portrait of how memory, symbolism, and emotion intertwine, how a childhood image can gain permanence in the mind even when the evidence disappears. And it reminds us of a larger truth. What we see is shaped not just by the eye, but by expectation. We carry symbols with us, of comfort, of childhood, of bounty. And sometimes, when we remember, we don't just recall what was there. We remember what made the moment feel complete, even if it never existed at all. Hello, Clarice. The words slither through pop culture like a whispered dare. They've been parodied in comedies, quoted at costume parties, etched into Halloween decorations. It's the moment, the chilling first greeting from Hannibal Lecter to FBI trainee Clarice Starling in The Silence of the Lambs. A line so iconic it seems burned into the fabric of cinema history. Except, it never happened. Anthony Hopkins, in his Oscar-winning performance, never utters those words. Not once. His actual greeting is, "Good evening, Clarice." No hello, no dramatic pause, no infamous delivery. Just a courteous, understated phrase that somehow never anchored itself in public memory. And yet millions remember it the other way. They can hear it, feel it. Some even mimic the intonation, the slow, sinister cadence of, "Hello, Clarice." The misquote has become larger than the film itself, referenced even by those who've never seen it. It's become the line, a cultural shorthand for psychological menace. But how does a line that was never spoken become more famous than the actual dialogue? Dr. Lynn Natal, who researches cinematic memory, points to expectation. The scene is so emotionally loaded, so charged with tension, that audiences prepare themselves for something dramatic. "Hello, Clarice" fits the bill. It's punchy, eerie, and oddly personal. It feels like something Lecter would say, and in many parodies he does. Films, TV shows, even commercials have repeated the false line for decades. These comedic echoes, replayed again and again, gradually overwrite the source in collective memory. The mind, when faced with a familiar moment, often replaces the original with the more complete version, the one shaped by years of repetition. It doesn't remember the scene, it remembers the expectation of the scene. Survey data backs this up. When asked to quote Lecter's first words, nearly 3/4 of respondents say, "Hello, Clarice." Even when shown the correct clip, many insist the quote must appear elsewhere in the film. But it doesn't. What's most striking is the specificity of the false memory. People don't just remember the words. They remember the voice, the pace, the sinister smile. They're not guessing. They're remembering, or at least their minds have convinced them they are. This case reveals how memory can be shaped not just by the original experience, but by everything that follows. Repetition, context, cultural reinforcement. These forces blur the line between what was and what should have been. And that's what makes the "Hello, Clarice" phenomenon so revealing. It's not about being wrong. It's about the power of cultural memory to invent its own truths. The quote never existed. But in a way, that only makes it stronger. It was created, collectively, by all of us, shaped in the spaces between scenes, forged in the echoes of retellings, born from what we expected a monster to say. And maybe that's the real horror. Not that Lecter said something terrifying, but that we did, again and again, until it became real. It's one of the most beloved and familiar logos in American culture, a bundle of ripe fruit, bursting with color and comfort. For millions, the Fruit of the Loom logo was more than a brand. It was a part of daily life, stitched into underwear waistbands, glimpsed in laundry baskets, associated with the simplicity of childhood routines. And in that image, unmistakably, was the cornucopia, a woven horn of plenty cradling the fruit. Brown, textured, tilted just so. Only it wasn't. The cornucopia never existed. Not once in the company's century-plus history has the Fruit of the Loom logo included the horn. Every official version, from the oldest tag designs to the latest packaging, shows only the fruit, apples, grapes, and leaves, arranged neatly against white. Yet ask the public and the story changes. Over 70% of respondents in multiple surveys report remembering the cornucopia. Many describe it vividly, even emotionally. Some say it was the first time they learned what a cornucopia was. They associate it with their parents folding laundry, with elementary school dressing rituals, with the quiet repetition of mornings long past. So why does a non-existent horn remain so powerfully imprinted? Dr. Carol Laney, a cognitive psychologist specializing in brand memory, suggests that our minds naturally seek completion. The idea of a horn of plenty, an ancient symbol of harvest and abundance, fits so perfectly behind a pile of fruit that the mind inserts it without question. But this is no random confusion. People don't just imagine a vague basket. They remember a specific one, its shape, color, and placement. The consistency of this collective false memory suggests something more than personal error. It's a shared narrative, reinforced by repetition and by absence. Part of the illusion's power lies in cultural storytelling. The cornucopia is a deeply familiar symbol, especially in North American imagery. It's seen in schools, on Thanksgiving tables, in holiday crafts. Over time, its presence behind a group of fruit became not just likely, but expected. Add to that decades of informal references, visual parodies, and off-brand illustrations that did depict the horn, and you begin to understand how the false image gained authority. The logo most people remember never existed, but the idea of it lived everywhere. This memory isn't just persistent, it's personal. For many, discovering the truth feels unsettling. They return to old clothing, digging through bins or drawers, hoping to find proof. But even vintage tags show only the fruit. No horn, no cornucopia. And still, they swear it was there. This phenomenon reminds us that memory, especially visual memory, is not a camera. It's a reconstruction, a layered composite of feeling, assumption, and cultural influence. It is not what the eye saw, but what the mind believed it should have seen. The Fruit of the Loom logo joins a growing list of examples where the collective mind has created a version of reality that never existed, yet persists with uncanny certainty. And maybe that's what makes this so fascinating, that in the quiet routines of life, getting dressed, folding shirts, watching our parents do the same, our minds didn't just store images. They completed them. Because sometimes it's not the fruit we remember. It's the story we built around it, woven, whole, and filled to the brim. A quiet boardroom, a polished script, a chilling voice. It's one of cinema's most iconic exchanges, the first meeting between a brilliant killer and a young FBI trainee. And almost everyone can quote it. "Hello, Clarice." But Anthony Hopkins never said that line. The truth, simple, confirmed, and endlessly replayable, is that he greeted her with, "Good evening, Clarice." Not hello, not the dramatic pause we've all mimicked, just a formal, understated welcome. And yet the false quote is everywhere. It's printed on T-shirts, whispered at Halloween parties, parodied in comedies, cartoons, and pop culture references. It's so deeply embedded in the cultural imagination that even fans of The Silence of the Lambs are shocked to learn it doesn't appear in the film. How did this happen? Dr. Lynn Nuttall, a memory researcher, points to the phenomenon of cinematic convergence, where audience expectations and repeated imitation gradually replace the source material. "Hello, Clarice" feels like what Lecter should say. It's the line that matches his elegance, his menace, his eerie calm. And once we hear it in a parody, spoken with just the right chill, it cements itself. The imitation becomes more memorable than the original, but this is more than a misquote. It's a psychological echo. People don't just remember the words, they remember the scene, the angle of the camera, the gleam in Lecter's eye, the deliberate way he forms her name. They remember feeling it. And in memory, feeling is truth. Neuroscientists studying these kinds of errors have found that the brain stores audiovisual memories as clusters of sensation, not exact transcripts. When we recall a scene, we're reconstructing it, not replaying it. And reconstruction is vulnerable to suggestion. That's why so many remember "Hello, Clarice" with such clarity. The phrase fits, it completes the scene, it satisfies a narrative rhythm. And in that satisfaction, the mind locks it in. Cultural reinforcement only deepens the groove. The false line is repeated so often in so many contexts that it begins to feel more real than the original. It's cleaner, more dramatic, easier to quote. It becomes shorthand for Lecter himself, an entire character captured in 3 words he never actually said. This isn't a failure of memory. It's a testament to how memory works, not as a file cabinet, but as a living story. A story we revise with each telling, each viewing, each conversation. And perhaps that's the secret power of "Hello, Clarice." It never existed in the script, but it lives in us, passed from one imagination to another, a phrase that echoes because it resonates, not because it's factual. In the end, what we remember from stories often says more about us than about the stories themselves. And sometimes the most unforgettable lines are the ones that were never spoken at all. What if the world we remember isn't the one we lived? Across 13 stories, we've walked through a strange gallery of false memories, each one vivid, consistent, and shared by millions. A president's death recalled years too early. A quote that echoes in our minds despite never being spoken. A logo, a map, a song lyric, all remembered in ways that never existed. Each case on its own might seem like a fluke, a quirk of human recall. But taken together, they point to something deeper, more unsettling. Our memories are not just flawed. They are crafted by culture, by expectation, by repetition, by us. These collective memory distortions, often called Mandela effects, are not merely errors. They are narratives. They are emotional truths mistaken for historical ones. And in a world flooded with media, symbols, and stories, our minds do what they've always done. They make sense of chaos. They seek completion. They fill in the blanks. But this process, once seen as a weakness, may be something else entirely. A window into how human consciousness weaves meaning from the fragmented threads of experience. The cases we've explored aren't about trickery or deception. They reveal how we build our inner world. When a memory is shared by millions, it gains authority, not because it's accurate, but because it resonates. Our brains are social, our memories collective. And when culture reflects an image back at us, even a false one, we internalize it as truth. So what does this mean for our understanding of history, of identity, of reality? It means we must hold our memories with humility, not as certainties, but as stories, not as facts, but as reflections of what mattered to us, what we feared, loved, expected, or needed at the time. Memory is not a recording. It is a mirror. one that reflects not just what we saw, but who we were when we saw it. And when that mirror fractures, when the reflection doesn't match the facts, we're forced to confront a profound truth. That reality is not just what happens, but what is remembered. And what is remembered is always being rewritten. So where does this leave us? Perhaps with more questions than answers. But maybe that's the point. If memory is a kind of fiction, lovingly and collectively composed, then the real story is not about what we get wrong. It's about why we remember the way we do. In the end, these mass memory changes are not errors to be corrected. They are clues to how we process time, to how we make meaning, to how we stay connected through a shared, if imperfect, version of the world. The past may be gone, but in our minds, beautifully, mysteriously, it is always being made. And maybe that's the greatest wonder of all.